Welcome to All In, a straight shooting, science-based podcast about periods, fertility, and nurturing health outside of unrealistic beauty expectations. We will mostly, but not exclusively, focus on hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA, a component of the female athlete triad, and relative energy deficiency in sport.
I'm Dr. Nicola Rinaldi, scientist and lead author of the book No Period, Now What? I specialize in helping people understand how their eating, exercise, and lifestyle habits are keeping them from hormonal health and their best life. My work focuses on regaining periods, improving fertility, and breaking free of the rules of underlying diet culture.
My name is Florence Gillet. I'm a certified eating psychology coach and the founder of BeyondBodyImage.com. I specialize in mental recovery, helping people let go of toxic health beliefs to finally feel at ease in their bodies at any size.
Every 2 weeks, the All In podcast brings you real recovery stories, expert insights, and new scientific research on HA, hormonal health, and fertility, with an unmissable touch of body respect and women's empowerment.
Just a reminder that this podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Music by the Andy Shulman Band, available on Spotify. Hi, Nicola. How are you?
Doing really well today. How about you?
Yes, very good. I'm glad to be here with you. And for this episode, we have a guest with us.
Yes, we do. I'd like to introduce to you our friend and compatriot in our support group, Shanta Gyanchand. So, Shanta, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of how you got to HA? You know, for many, it's a combination of underfueling and overexercise. And tell us a little bit about your story and also about your background, because I've learned a lot of things about you since we've known each other that have surprised me. So tell us a little more.
Well, hi, Florence, and hi, Nicola. Thank you for having me. So I was a psychosexual therapist when I developed HA. So, often the carers don't take care of themselves, as it were. So I was already practicing not only as a psychosexual therapist, but then I moved country. So from England to India, looking after my mother who had dementia. And I started working for a company as a vice president, setting up dementia care homes.
Wow.
So there was a huge amount of stress.
That's busy.
That's very busy. And I very much had this culture ingrained in me of just say yes, just say yes, just say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Positivity.
Never heard about that culture.
This positivity culture. And even though I would tell other people to have boundaries and say no, I just wasn't, doing that in my own life. So I obviously had so many different responsibilities, and these are all high responsibility jobs. And as the responsibility went up, and I already had stress from being a carer of my mother who had dementia for years, as that responsibility went up, the pressure on myself to be more perfect and do things more perfectly went up. And that's when it slipped into eating disorder behavior, which I didn't pick up on. And I was doing all the right things as a therapist. I was seeing a therapist who was supposed to be helping me and knew I had some issues with body dysmorphia and eating disorders in my past. So I was doing all the right things. Unfortunately, and one of the things I've learned from this process is my therapist didn't really know the first thing about eating disorders. And the literature they would have looked up was really misinformed. So,
and I think that happens a lot, right? People kind of seek therapy because they realize that there is something not quite right and they don't feel great, or they have heightened anxiety around food and their bodies. But then seeing a therapist, someone who might not be trained in eating disorder, can be actually worse, right?
Oh, yes. I definitely benefited from just losing the therapist. And then I didn't get better until I lost the therapist. And I could do it by myself once I lost the therapist. So that was interesting. And as a therapist, it was something I thought I would be able to pick up on. But these are not things which are discussed within therapy, which is this therapist right for certain conditions? Although you're supposed to only work within your reference or framework,
Yes.
you know, there are a lot of factors which aren't taken into account. And I think one of them is that I had a male therapist. Men often are pushing an agenda without realizing it, which is a very male agenda, which can make issues worse because they don't understand what it is to have a body which menstruates.
Mm-hmm.
That's not always true, but unless they're highly sensitized, they may not be as sensitive about things like weight language, numbers, whilst
Mm-hmm.
many people who menstruate and have identified as women will maybe, not always, but maybe understand the pressures regarding those things more.
That's a really interesting perspective.
Mm.
Yeah, I think so many of the pressures on us that lead us into HA, disordered eating, eating disorders, come from society and wanting to please the men around us.
Yeah.
And so I can see how that would be hard for somebody who doesn't identify as female to understand and um, help you make sense of.
I think so. For me personally, part of healing was doing quite a lot of radical uh, defragging, I was going to say, getting rid of men who had subtle toxic messages for me in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And, luckily, my husband wasn't one of them. He's always like very happy that he survived. He survived that.
He went through the ring of fire.
I got rid of,
The
and
same
there's
for my husband, Shanta. He's not the only one.
But I realized there were a lot of people who were giving me, and women as well, who were giving me messages which were not healthy for me. And that's a very hard process to go through as a person. Whether you're a man or a woman or whatever age or whatever it is that you're trying to heal from, to realize that there are people in your life who may be people you think are on your side who are actually just not giving you the messages you need.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times it's because they don't know any better because they are so steeped in the diet culture that we all live in that often people around us think they just have the same messages that you're getting from the media because that's all they know.
And I think there's also something interesting that I haven't read that book yet, but I have it in my bookcase. It's waiting. I think it's called Invisible Women. Is the question that science itself, research itself, is actually mostly done by male, and so they don't even pick up on some stuff that females would, right? So for me, like if I think of birth control, for example, it's a good example. I just can't believe that we haven't been able in 2020 to find more birth control, more options for birth control. And if you think of the side effects that lots of birth control is bringing to us, identifying as females, it's just impossible. We've gone through 40, 60 years of this and no one has picked up on maybe finding something better, but we have all these algorithms for social media. I mean, you may wonder, it's so I
Lots
think
and
it's
lots of algorithms for dating, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, and the whole whatever Viagra and penis enlargement, big market. Which one is the most important, right? Birth control, or anyway? So sorry, I'm going on a tangent. I'm just curious, Shanta, what age were you when you kind of got yourself into this situation where you said yes to everything and slowly, I guess, developed the need for controlling your food or your body?
I was in my 30s and I'd had very short bursts of hypothalamic amenorrhea before in my teens, when I, had shorter periods of eating disorders in response to things which were quite understandable, like a parent's death. So,
Of
yeah,
course.
so that would be quite, and each time that had happened, doctors had picked up on it very well. And doctors had all,
Okay.
and I've been very lucky in my teens. The doctors who picked up on it just told me, stop exercising, eat at me. They were giving me like diet advice of like 3,000 calories a day, which is right for that age.
Yeah.
And, don't worry if you just eat pizzas every day for a month, that's fine.
Wow.
You just
Wow,
have to get
that's
your periods.
amazing.
Yeah, I was just really lucky as a teenager. So I knew that that's what should work. So when I got to my 30s and I lost all this weight and I was really stressed, I understood what was happening because I had all the knowledge. I just wasn't able to get better immediately. And I did put the weight back on, but I put it on undercaloried. And this is something so many women in the support group experience, is that they're saying, oh, I'm putting on weight on 1,500 calories a day. I can't possibly eat 2,500 calories a day. So I was putting on weight on 1,200 calories a day, 1,300 calories a day, and which is a scarily low amount. And I got back
Crazy.
up to my pre-HA weight, having never eaten more than 1,500 calories, like never. So my body had no surplus to actually get better on it. It was just holding on to fat in order to, use it later to survive. And
Wow.
I didn't know why I wasn't getting better. Because of diet culture, because of the advice I was being given also by doctors, right?
So were you actually diagnosed with HA at that time, or did you how did you come out of that, I guess is the question.
So I assumed I had HA. I didn't have the words HA. I just had that it was starvation-induced secondary amenorrhea, which I'd had in my teens. So I assumed that that's what was going on. But then I got back to my normal BMI. It was low normal BMI, which was abnormal for me. I'd never been in that range normally. But I got back there and it hadn't come back. And all the books said it should have come back. All the books, all the literature is about teenagers, right? With anorexia. So this doesn't help. It's not about people in their 30s with anorexia. So I went off to the doctors and they ran a whole lot of blood tests on me and they diagnosed me as having reached early menopause.
Oh God.
So I had low levels of what's called anti-Müllerian hormone, which about 20 years ago, there was some studies done and they found that low anti-Müllerian hormone correlates with low egg reserve or fertility issues. And ever since that, they just decided that low AMH means that you're getting menopause or you're going to get menopause soon or you have fertility issues without a huge amount of evidence that that's the case. So I had low AMH, and because I had amenorrhea, I had a higher FSH. It wasn't really in postmenopausal area. It was only 18, which isn't postmenopausal at all. But they decided, it is going into it, but if you haven't had a period for like 2 years, which I hadn't, you would expect your FSH to be through the roof at that point if you had actually reached menopause, right? Much, much higher. Sorry, this is very technical for people who are listening and like, what's FSH? But anyone who's going through any fertility treatments will understand what these words mean. So,
and I think they can always get the book. The book is really clear about what all these hormones are doing, what their roles are. So if you don't know what we're talking about, go get No Period Now What. There's a link in the show notes.
So I started taking hormonal replacement therapy, which is what they put me on. And because I understand now, my body was trying to go through follicular waves. And I think I was probably trying to ovulate. My hormones were going all over the place. So the hormone replacement therapy responded really badly. I got melasma on my skin and I was getting lots of side effects from it. Although I was getting good side effects as well. I was getting all those hormones which you don't have when you have HA. And I was enjoying the hormones. Not all women do. And I was realizing I was missing something. So I still wasn't convinced by what the first doctor told me. So I went to a second. They told me the same thing. The second was a fertility specialist. She specifically told me not to put on more weight when I told her I'd been underweight. She told me not to go and ruin my lovely figure.
Mm.
Oh, great.
And she told,
But,
yeah.
sorry, I'm just interrupting you very quickly because I find it's an important point, is the fact that your body was actually gaining weight on a very low amount of calories
Yeah.
still, really fighting to survive, right?
Yes.
Holding on to whatever you were giving. And I think this is a common misconception also for recovery, is that people don't understand that it's not just the weight that you're going to gain, and it's not actually going back into a normal BMI that's going to guarantee that your period is back. Because if you still eat really low amount of calories, or you're still in energy deficit, the energy deficit is the core, right, Nicola?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think there's this constant confusion. Like, I have people with periods who come to me all the time and they say, I don't understand it. I gained the weight back. This is where I used to be. How come I don't have? And then you check and they're still eating really low amounts of food, or they're still over exercising.
Yep.
And you're like, that is the problem. And I think it's really difficult to understand that in a culture that keeps telling us that if you're a normal, quote unquote, weight according to BMI, which we know BMI doesn't say much, if anything at all, about health, then you'll be fine. And so that is really crucial. But I'm going to let you continue, Shanta, because obviously the doctor saying don't ruin your lovely figure is like, must win an award, right?
It was pretty hard. She also told me specifically not to give up running because that was really healthy for me. Because I took these issues to her. I said I'd had an eating disorder. I'm not back at the weight I used to be, but I'm in my normal BMI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said to her, maybe I should just should I quit running? Should I just eat more fats? I was asking the right questions to doctors, but they were giving me bad advice. And these were specialists. These were endocrinologists. There was one endo I saw who was like the third person I saw, but that was after this fertility specialist who just gave me such bad advice. It almost ruined my marriage. It was so much pressure on the marriage to be going through fertility treatment, which wasn't working because I wasn't eating enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
I think that's another really common experience is doctors thinking, oh, we can just do fertility treatments and you'll get pregnant. And certainly from the people that I've worked with and the data I have for no period, now what? Yeah, it does work for some people, but there can also be so many issues that you have when you are continuing to underfuel and trying to press your body to ovulate when it's not ready, and trying to get pregnant when your body's not ready. So there can be a lot more challenges in any of the fertility treatments and the cycles, and than would be the case when somebody does actually start nourishing their body properly and cutting out the high intensity exercise.
Medicine has this approach of, you have a problem, here is a pill. You have a problem, here is some sort of chemical that's going to make you get pregnant, make you not get pregnant, make your hormones in check. And I like to see that there are more and more doctors that actually question, the way people live their lives. And they're like, okay, you have this problem, and obviously we can support you with medication. I have nothing against medication, don't get me wrong, but I like to see that it's done in conjunction with asking also, how do you actually live your life? And Shanta, correct me if I'm wrong, did anybody actually ask you how much you eat, like how much you exercise, what kind of stress levels do you experience?
One dietitian did. And one dietitian told me to eat a lot more carbs. Lovely woman. She actually rang me every day for a week to make sure I was eating more carbs. Even though that wasn't her job at all. I think she just realized I wasn't eating enough. But none of the other doctors. The thing that signaled me that there was a real problem was that my heart rate was not going up. And my heart rate was really, really low. And I was going through life thinking that my heart was really, really healthy, because you hear low heart rate, really, really healthy. And I went for a checkup, and it was all these same doctors who were like, carry on as you are. And I had all these symptoms, and they were all acting like they were strange symptoms they didn't understand, right? There I was starving. And that's when I was underweight. And I had high B12 because any pills I was taking, it was not actually going into my body. It was just like building up in my body. I had, all kinds of anemia that just wouldn't get better. And then I had this low heart rate, and they said, oh, you exercise, that's fine. And someone came into the clinic, a doctor who happened to work with athletes in India. This was in India. And he looked at me and said, how much do you run? And I went, oh, look, I run like 20 minutes, half an hour a day. He said, is that it? What else do you do? I said, I do, weights for 20 minutes a day. He said, is that all? I said, yeah, I do 50 minutes exercise a day. And he said, yeah, you don't have athletic heart. Your heart is atrophying.
Oh, wow.
He said, it's a dangerous condition. Your heart is atrophying. He said, because he saw it in athletes as well. He said, athletes who are underfueling. Now, he didn't understand the period side of things, but he did understand that athletes who underfuel, their hearts aren't healthy. They're getting heart damage. And he sent me back. He just said, I want you to stay in bed for 2 weeks. I don't want you I don't want you moving with a heart level this low until your heart level rises.
Wow.
And
I think we discussed this in another episode with Nicola. Actually, we discussed this I think it's in the HA Basics episode. I will link to that also in the show notes, where the difference between low heart rate because you're an athlete versus low heart rate because you are starving. So if you want to hear more about that, there's more in another episode that we covered in the past. So where did you go from there, Shanta?
Well,
you went to see more professionals?
I saw more professionals. I saw one endocrinologist who actually did realize what my issue was, although he also thought that I was going through the beginnings of menopause. He thought it might be able to be reversed. He was going to put me on Clomid. But his problem was he had such a bad bedside manner that it was very, very difficult to listen to him. So, some doctors, his bedside manner was absolutely terrible. And his way of examining women was rather inhumane. He would have all the women he needed to examine line up in a queue at 9 o'clock in the morning. We had to get there at 8:30. Go into a cubicles, which was like a barn, I felt like I was a barn animal, change into skirts and go in one to one into a room where, he would do internal examination within 5 minutes. And then we had to go and wait for another 4 hours to see him to talk about it.
Oh, that sounds horrific.
It was horrific. So I was like, he actually knew what he was talking. Yeah. And this is again, India, the treatment of women's bodies in India. People who identify as women's bodies in India and anyone with a uterus is terrible. But he did understand I had HA. So he was the one doctor who gave me the clue that I needed to look up more of this information. And that's when I joined the support group. And I started to listen to other women's, stories. And I think, I asked a few times about my hormone levels because the next time I got my hormones checked, they were fine, apart from they weren't fine, but my FSH was fine. It was just my estrogen, which was low. And hormones weren't also hormone replacement therapy wasn't making my estrogen levels rise, which was weird. Like, why would that be? So there was a hypothalamic pituitary problem, and I had enough knowledge as a psychosexual therapist that what was going on was a pituitary issue of some, if my body was not responding to hormonal therapy. So I listened to this group for a while, and I took it to my therapist, my terrible therapist, and my terrible therapist was like, oh, well, if you eat too much, it might be very distressing for you. And after a little while, I started talking to my husband about, my therapy, and he's like, this does not sound like good messages. This sounds like bad messages. Yeah. And I was like, yeah. So I dumped the bad therapist, and I on the same day I quit my fitness my fitness pal account, which at the time allowed you like to eat next to nothing and without even raising an alarm, right? I think they've changed that a little. So I deleted that because I didn't need to be tracking, and I started eating, and
Wow.
and it was really hard, and it was really painful at times, and I'm sure other people will talk about the fact that you can get a lot of physical body pain, and that can be very difficult to trust the process when you feel like you're sick for the first month and your body hurts and you feel weak. But I carried on until I recovered, and it took me 3 months to recover when I just went all in.
Can I ask you then, between the time you found the support group and the time you decided to go all in, did that go quite fast for you, or?
I think it was about 6 months. And I think from seeing other women in the support group, it's the same, because this is the only place you're getting this information, right? Everywhere else you go, doctors, therapists, everyone, I think, apart from my husband and my sister, who are like, just eat and get fat. We don't like, we're fine. Just get fat as fat as you want. But everyone else is like telling you, oh, you don't want to put on too much weight. And you get such toxic messages, positive messages when you are underweight. And we discussed this, we were discussing this the other week, that we get, when I was really thin, I got terrible positive messages to the point that I was worried that people were looking at me when I knew I was unwell and thinking, that's great. And I used to tell women especially that I was ill, because I really worried me that women were looking at me and thinking that they wanted my body as a body girl when I was sick. But also I was aware of so much, when I say positive feedback, like doors opening. And I think one of the problems when we tell women just to ignore society is that we're telling them to ignore the reality of fat phobia that they live with, rather than saying, yes, fat phobia is there and we have to fight it together. You're saying it's not real. A lot of the time people tell women, oh, you don't have to feel worried about yourself. You'll be fine, rather than being honest with ourselves about the fact that we treat people who are slimmer better in our society. And we treat people who meet certain beauty standards better. And women who have a lot of opposition in many different areas, in work, in life. In India, there's a lot of like repression and sexual harassment. It's a very difficult area. But if you meet certain standards, you start getting better treatment. And when we tell women, don't worry about that or that, what we're actually saying is be fine without the one bit of advantage, which isn't advantage because you're starving yourself, but which is the one bit of advantage you get in the society which is stacked against you.
True.
Rather than being honest about the fact that the society needs changing.
Absolutely. And it's really difficult, I think, you've explained your journey, which is so long and painful and complicated, and how much resilience do you need as a human, right? To go through being told over and over again, don't do this is fine, blah, blah, blah. And no, you kept persevering, right? But in reality, this is not something that everybody will be able to do or have the knowledge for, or have the understanding. So I think it's I totally agree with you, and I'm curious to know, like, as you were going all in and realizing that you had to face all those fears as well, right? You're losing a bit of that advantage that society keeps giving to certain bodies and not others. What was some of your ways to tackle this? Because you obviously had the knowledge of being a psychosexual therapist. So was that knowledge valuable at that time, or is it something that you had to completely learn as you were doing and facing those fears? What kind of helped you?
I think I had all the tools, and that's what was useful for me, and that's why I could do what I did without a therapist. While kicking my therapist to the curb, I could do what I did. I think for a lot of other people who are going through hypothalamic amenorrhea, it's important to get that professional help, but professional help that understands your issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for me, I knew that I needed to meditate. I needed to really focus on self-care. I stopped working. I gave up my work for a while so I could just focus on myself. I changed careers. I decided to just focus on writing and creative work in order to nurture myself.
Mm-hmm.
But mainly, I spent real time working on self-care each day, which is a practice. And one of the articles on the HA website was really useful, which was about morning rituals and creating morning rituals which were useful when you don't exercise anymore. I think it was one of your blogs, Nicola. So I read that and I thought, yep. So I started doing that, and I put together a very comprehensive self-care program every morning for myself so that I could get through the day, And I didn't do self-affirmations. I did self-affirming questions, because I think a question is more of an active. So rather than saying you are beautiful to myself, because that's complicated. Sometimes beauty is a complicated feeling. Not all, I would say, in what way are you beautiful today? Tell me in three ways that you're beautiful today. Tell me, 3 ways in which today is going to be a good day. Tell me a story about, day before. And I'd be asking myself active questions.
Oh, I love that.
Active positive questions. Yeah. I think it's much more useful. Yeah.
I totally agree that for me also, like, affirmations in recovery was actually really difficult. And I think if you're effectively, in disordered eating, you are also in body hate and in a lot of fear, and you don't have that much cognitive bandwidth as well. So I found that it was quite difficult for me to be able to come out of that self-hatred and tell myself, you're beautiful, you're worthy, all of these things. It came after for me that I was able to use that, but not immediately. So I like your idea of self-affirmative questions. And I totally agree with you, like self-care and exchanging some of the difficult, strenuous exercise routines for something that actually nurtures your soul and makes you feel better despite all those challenges is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
I think one useful thing to remember, and you talked about bandwidth, is the effect that starvation has on the body. And it doesn't matter whether you fell into a disordered way of eating because you have an eating disorder actively, or because you just went on a diet and that diet took you into starvation. The body doesn't know the difference.
Right.
And especially, or you're training really hard and you're under fueling, your body doesn't know the difference. It just knows it's starving, and it can physiologically trigger an eating disorder. We don't know at this time whether that's for genetic reasons or just physiological, but even people who are perfectly healthy, who are taken through a starvation program, will end up with eating disordered behavior.
Yep.
That rings very true with the Minnesota starvation study that was done in the 1940s. And I think another really important point to make here is that it's really common when people are under fueling for their brains not to work as well. You cannot think as well as you can when you're fully fueled, because our brains take something like 30% of our energy. And if you're not providing your body with enough energy, then it's cutting down in all the places that it can. And one of those places it can is not sending as much energy to your brain. And so I think there's a physiological reason behind why we get into those disordered thought patterns and feel a lot of brain fog or inability to think straight. And that those are all very common symptoms for people who are consistently underfueling.
Yeah,
I,
obsessive, anxious,
Mm-hmm.
all of those. I mean, I find that they tend to slowly ease up as you are better fueled, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. You
yes.
start to be able to see more clearly. And one more thing that I'd like to say is that I totally agree with what you're both saying about the fact that sometimes, we get into starvation also completely unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it interesting. It goes back to what you were saying, Shanta, about having HA episodes as a teen when you had to face difficult life situations, right? The death of a close person or, big changes in your life. Sometimes we can be in a situation where we don't eat enough. And it's not that we're doing it to lose weight, or it's not that we're
Mm.
doing it to get into a certain body, but we're just unintentionally not eating enough. And in some of us, that can also actually instill a bit of a disordered eating pattern after that. I've seen it over and over again. And I know that for those of you that are listening to us and that are recovered, it's something to be mindful
Mm-hmm.
of as you go through life, that whatever happens to you, whether it is, grief or difficult situations in life, that you are conscious to keep feeding yourself properly, because you know that your body has this tendency to kind of immediately go into starvation mode. And then
Well,
it's more of a mental issue as much as a physical issue, right?
yeah, and I did have the tools to understand that. To discuss a little bit about what I understand happens physiologically, is that starvation affects the brain, and it affects how much energy the body has to create new neural pathways.
Mm-hmm.
And it can
Mm-hmm.
cause a certain amount of brain atrophication, which is pretty scary when you think about it, right? All these women going on diets, who are getting their brain atrophied from dieting, right? Their brain just stops making new neural pathways.
It's crazy.
When you're going into the starvation, and you are making all these neural pathways telling you to be anxious about food and watch how much you eat and think
Mm-hmm.
about food all the time, that's the last point that you've been making new connections in your brain, and then you stop and you go into
Mm-hmm.
you can go into very high anxiety, or you can go into hypervigilance, which can make you feel like you're very sharp, and you can sometimes
Right.
take on new information but not take on new behaviors.
Mm.
So you can find a lot of people getting into HA when they're studying and seeming to do really well in their studies, although they're probably doing worse than they would have if they weren't starving, right? Because they're hypervigilant, so they don't sleep so much, and they're reading all the time because they're obsessive.
Mm-hmm.
But then when it comes to changing the behavior of eating, which should be a simple thing, this is not a person who thinks they have an eating disorder. They can't, because their brain is still stuck on watch what you eat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I believe asking positive questions to yourself while you're also fueling is helping the brain making those new neural pathways as you're
Mm-hmm.
healing. Uh, and
Amazing.
also understanding that afterwards, starvation can physically trigger those pathways that think in an eating disordered way. So I
Mm-hmm.
was
Yep.
very aware for a year and a half after I recovered, that if I just skipped a meal because we were stuck in traffic, I would suddenly find myself spiraling, and I realized I had to eat a double dinner. Right? That was
Mm-hmm.
the risk.
Yeah.
And I'm
I
sure
think
this
this
is
is
something you see a
super
lot, Nicola.
important.
Yeah.
With people relapsing into HA.
Yep. Yeah. It's very easy for people to get back into it with just a small change in behavior, like you're saying, skipping a meal, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh well, I didn't need that one, so why do I need the next one? And the next thing you know, you're tumbling down the rabbit hole of losing your period again, and having to go through all the hard work again.
And I think the mental stress that goes with all of that, right?
Hmm.
That's not to be underestimated. So, Shanta, you got your period back after 3 months of being all
Yes.
in, and you had the desire to have a child, right? Because you went to see all those fertility doctors as well. So, what happened after that? Would you be able to tell us a bit more about your fertility journey?
So I didn't want children at the time I went to the fertility doctors, but I was concerned because I didn't have a period. So I was
Hmm.
very much pushed into the fertility conveyor belt, is what I call it, where you're suddenly put on this conveyor belt of stuff, and it doesn't matter what you want. So I'd be saying, look, I don't want a baby. I want my periods back so I can have a baby later. And all
Hmm.
the doctors were like, don't worry, we'll get you pregnant. I was like, did you hear what I just said? No. So my focus once I got my periods back was to just let my body heal for a year,
Hmm.
because it
Yeah.
was my belief that that's just good practice. And if I was going to get pregnant, then I wanted to, let my body get as much healing done as possible to my bones and my brain and, the epigenetics before I got pregnant so that I was healthy for my baby.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And of course, that's very hard for some people who just, they're on their timetable for when they want their baby. And luckily, I didn't have
Uh-huh.
that. And I also didn't really believe I could get pregnant because I'd been told by so many doctors that it was just impossible. Like, even after I got my periods back, there were doctors saying, yeah, but your age, your AMH is really, really low.
Hmm.
And for women out there who have got this low AMH reading and have been dieting or have lost weight or have gone through a bereavement, or, or have been transitioning into being a man but want to still have a baby with their partner, and they haven't taken the hormones yet, but their period has disappeared. Low AMH by itself doesn't indicate low fertility. And this is a really important point for anyone going through fertility treatment, because it's known now, and not all doctors either tell you this or have done the reading. So if you are otherwise healthy and have low AMH, then you are as likely to get pregnant as a normal person. When I say normal, another person who doesn't have fertility issues. If you have other
Yeah.
fertility issues, then it can make it more difficult.
I've also done some reading about this. There's a section in the book about the diagnosis of diminished ovarian reserve based
Yes, there
essentially
is. Yeah.
solely on AMH, and so there's that, and there's also there's absolutely research that backs up what you've just been saying. So we can link to that in the show notes as well for anyone who's interested.
This is so crucial. I love that you mentioned this, because I think when you get to the doctor and you have the hopes to get pregnant and you're already very stressed out, and they come and say you have low AMH and you don't know what that means, and you get even more stressed out, I think just it shows how much just bringing that knowledge and actually having the ability to advocate for yourself is really truly super important.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't have if it wasn't for Nicola. It was a session with Nicola which gave me that information and armed me with that information. And the book, which is just so useful. So I waited about how long? 3.5 years, and then my husband was like, "We should try." And I'm like, "Oh, but all the doctors say," and he said, "Okay, the doctors are wrong about your periods." So let's just try and let's see. And my son is now in the other room being looked after by his daddy, so that
Oh.
went just fine.
It's amazing. What an amazing story. I'm so glad you shared this with us. It's just a lot of resilience. I'm in awe of you going through so many practitioners and so many comments and not actually spiraling out of control in your eating disorder, but saying, nope, this is not right. It doesn't feel right. I'm just going to keep looking.
I think also for those who are struggling with any eating disordered behavior, whether it's a full eating disorder or whether it's you just can't eat enough because of other things going on in your life, finding a good therapist, having had a bad one, is so crucial.
Truly.
And finding a therapist who really understands, a therapist who isn't scared of you putting on weight,
Yeah.
I would say is very, very crucial.
Fat positive, body positive therapists.
Yeah.
And we can totally link to that as well.
Yeah.
I can share resources on where to look so that, you know, there is a point of entry somewhere or types of therapy also that are typically not, you know, focused on getting into a certain weight or but that will really heal the mind as much as the body and allow for the body to go wherever it needs to be to gain health again. So I will totally link to that. You're so right. Not getting any therapist. And look, sometimes it's difficult, right? Insurance and some limitations. Access to treatment can be really, really tough in many different places in the world. And I know that's in a lot of places also is they look at you and they say, if you are a normal BMI, we will not actually allow treatment because you are not sick enough. But again, I think it's worth keeping learning, searching, finding ways. There are also resources that can help, even if you can't access treatment. So I'm going to try and put some of those in the show notes so people can kind of know where to look and where to start.
Like Florence was saying, your recovery journey is remarkable. Can you tell us a little bit about how that journey has informed what you're doing today? You know, in your life, your work, you know, everything else.
I think it made me a better feminist. This is the thing I think mostly is it made me a better feminist. And when I say feminist, I mean, you know, advocating for better gender rights across the board. Yeah.
Yep.
It made me aware of how much people with uteruses are being badly treated across the board.
Yeah.
I'm currently editing a book which looks into the history of how people of color's bodies, women of color's bodies were treated historically. So it informed the way I decided to look at the world in, you know, on the intellectual level. On the other, I think All In becomes a bit of a philosophy for life.
That's what we like to think.
So I, you know, and I fight against that, you know, that yes culture of suffering. It's an odd culture because it's a positive word, but it's for doing more and getting more tired, right? So I still fight against that a little bit in myself, but I do have a lot more of an all-in attitude towards my life, which is I don't let myself restrict myself in any area. And it's very useful. I think at least once a week, it used to be every day, but at least once a week, I'm very grateful for that all-in mentality because I'm a mum now, I'm breastfeeding, and, you know, society tells you, you know, you lose the baby weight within 6 months, and I haven't, and I don't beat myself up about that, and I don't worry every time I'm eating ice cream because this is like, I need the calcium. I'm aware of this. You know, you need the food to make the breast milk, whilst again, there are these terrible messages to make your body performative as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And it's one of the
there are
things,
actually a lot of people who fall into HA postpartum because of that pressure to basically look like you were never pregnant. And, you know, as quickly as you can after you've had birth, you're supposed to go back to being this, you know, again, as small as possible. Don't look like you had a baby. Don't look like you're breastfeeding. Just, go back to being essentially in this childlike body that's glamorized and glorified. And so a lot of people after having babies lose weight way too quickly, and pick up exercise, and it's don't end up getting their periods back even when they do stop breastfeeding. So I think it's all part and parcel of the same pressures that we face to manipulate our bodies. And so I'm really glad that having gone through recovery before having a baby has helped you to avoid that postpartum.
Well, I think being in the part of the support group and being an admin, every time I have a negative little voice start in my head, I then have to go and tell women and other people with HA, do not fall for this voice. So that kind of helps me not fall for my own voice.
Uh-huh.
That's lovely. Something I would like to add to that is that the voice is not going to disappear. I'm
Right.
afraid to tell you. I would love for you to say, like, I'm recovered and the voice is gone. The voice is going to stay there. It's not going to be as loud or as frequent, but the voice is still going to show up sometimes. And I know it does for me as well. The only difference is that I know I don't have to act upon it to feel better. And I think self-care, like you said before, Shanta, was key for me, is also to learn how to take care of myself, really not taking care of myself again in a performative way. Oh, I'm taking care of myself. I'm having my hair done so I can look nice for other people. No, I'm taking care of myself. And that might mean I'm going to let my husband watch the kids because I can't see anybody right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I don't know, like decide that I need to go for a walk, or, it has nothing to do with the way I look or the way I perform, how feminine or good looking I am, which I think for many of us, it can take a while to kind of see the difference, because when we think of self-care, sometimes people think, oh, it means having a bath or your nails done or whatever, smelling nice. It can, if it makes you feel good, but not if it's going to be in an objective of, at least I'm going to conform to the standards, which we know are just. The other thing is those standards are completely unattainable. We keep telling women that they should, as you said, Nicola, after having a baby, they should look like they didn't have one. They should act at work like they're not mothers, and act at home like they don't have work. I mean, it's just completely unrealistic. So I think questioning that, putting that at the back, in the back scene, saying like, I know you're there, but I'm just not gonna use those behaviors. I don't have to answer the voice. I don't have to answer the societal demand that is placed on me. And and I think sometimes, as you said, also husbands can be great support for that if they are able to turn into feminists themselves, which is not always possible. Don't get me wrong. But it could be also really close friends. It could be family members, people that remind you that they will love you no matter what. And they obviously don't love you because you look a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that leads us to our last question. And Shanta, you created the best bridge for us. We don't know anything to do. Maybe we should have put you on the podcast on your own. You could have run it. Is a question we like to ask ourselves when we are recording alone, or the guests that we have on board, is how are you all in right now?
Right now, how am I all in? Well, food-wise, I snack almost continuously in order to keep my energy up for breastfeeding. So
Yes.
yeah, so right now I'm all in because my baby is exploring food, and he doesn't really like the baby. Like, he doesn't like to be fed. He likes to sit on my hip and nibble on what I'm nibbling.
Bless him.
So that's one thing. And I was just saying, he's growing really fast, and it's hard to get enough calories in him. So I'm breaking out my recovery recipes. for him. So I'm breaking out some of like the porridge with extra egg yolks in and stuff to get enough calories in him. It's hard to be all in life-wise during lockdown, right? Because there's so many restrictions on us.
True.
Yeah. So I think part of it is that taking a little bit of time for self-care, and as a parent, it's even harder to find time for self-care.
Nearly impossible.
So taking time for real self-care every day, depending on when you're a parent or whatever your situation in lockdown is, and during this pandemic is, that self-care can be just getting out of bed one day. It can be staying in bed for one day as well, and not performing at all, but making sure you're giving yourself that self-care during this time.
I love that.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add, Nicola?
No, I think that's a lovely way to end our show today. Just taking care of yourself, and self-care is a beautiful way to be all in, because that's something that we're not really very encouraged to do. So I think, I think that really taking that time for ourselves is a beautiful way to be all in.
Totally. Shanta, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of the knowledge that you've built, which is amazing and huge. And we're so blessed to have you on the support group. You are such an amazing admin, and I'm glad that other people get access to your knowledge as well.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have been here. It's also a pleasure to be part of the admin group and be, in contact with both of you and see so many people who have HA doing so amazing work every single day. That's very gratifying to watch.
Absolutely.
True. Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to end the recording here.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Maybe take a few minutes to reflect on it and how you have been all in this past week. It always strikes me how different each person's all-in journey is. As I often say, there are many paths to HA and many paths out of it. Your journey is unique.
That is so true. And if you need more support on your journey, you should definitely start with No Period Now What, which you can get at noperiod.info/book.
And Florence and I both work with people on different aspects of period recovery and so much more. So if you'd like more personal advice and attention, you can go to noperiod.info/appointments to schedule a time to speak with me on fixing the issues underlying your missing periods and figuring out what those issues are.
And I'm at beyondbodyimage.com to work with me on the deeper emotional issues and your body image. I also run a French Instagram account, aminore_fr. And obviously you can find Nicola at No Period Now What on Instagram. We also have joint clients, so you can access both our domains of expertise at the same time. If you enjoyed this podcast and found it helpful, please drop us a review to help more people find it.
Also, join the No Period Now What recovery support group at noperiod.info/support and let us know how All In is going for you.
All In is not just about period recovery, it's about getting your life back. See you in 2 weeks.
You were lost in fat love till you got lost again. You were lost in fat love. Now find yourself and then take all that you've learned about my love and loss, pleasure and pain, and never get lost again.